The Sony ZV-1 is a compact mirrorless camera that can shoot video at up to 4K 30 frames per second and also 1080p 120 frames per second, and photos at 20 megapixels. Now before I go over all the basic specs, let's start off with who the Sony ZV-1 is even for. Now I've used this as my main camera for the last 4.5 months for this YouTube channel, product photography, audio tests, vlogging, and even outdoor video and photos. The Sony ZV-1 is at its best when you're using it just like I'm using it right now on a tripod for talking head videos. Beauty vloggers making makeup tutorials or reviews, Twitch streamers, or maybe if you're getting on Zoom calls, uses like that, and I'll explain why in detail throughout this review. It's also good but not perfect for product photography. If you're selling something on eBay or like you have an Etsy shop or something like that, you're taking pictures of any sort of products that you might be selling, or taking pictures of things around the house, or taking pictures indoors where you have decent light, this thing does well at that. Now the ZV-1 is actually marketed as a traditional vlogging camera where you're like walking around and holding it. Maybe you're outside and just like, documenting your day. But if you are going to be talking into this while walking, I don't think that this is that good of a choice. Now, when it comes to outdoor photography, you can take pictures of landscapes, but when it comes to taking stills of like wildlife and anything that's moving that you have to get kind of close to, it's going to struggle just to how the low light performance is just like okay due to the sensor size and the lens. And also like I said, you really do have to get kind of close up to different subjects because the lens doesn't zoom that far. So the way I'm going to review this camera is by talking about each of those different use cases individually. But first, the specs. Now, if you're not well versed in camera jargon, don't worry. I'll list all the specifications just so that you have them up front, but I'm going to explain how each one is relevant throughout this review, and that should give you a good idea of what each of the different terms mean. Now, here are the frame rates and resolutions that the ZV-1 records. Again, it can do 1080 up to 120 frames per second, 4K 30, which is what I'm using right now. Now, the 4K does have a few catches. I'm actually going to switch over to the 1080 60 in a second so I can demonstrate. But first of all, the 4K 30, it only records 30 frames per second. It's not going to be as smooth if I'm moving right here. I have a shutter speed at 1/60 right now, and this is f1.8, but it's not going to be as smooth as if I turned it to 60 frames per second. Secondly, the 4K has quite a bit of a crop applied to it. It's not major, but like this is where my hand reaches right here when it's at 4K 30 frames per second. So let me go ahead and change this to 1080p 60 frames per second. All right, now we're at 1080 60, and there's a lot more room for my hand to go to the edge of the screen. Also, a whole lot more fluid. I still have it at 1/60. You can increase the shutter speed to double if you want. I find after 60 frames per second doesn't really matter as far as the motion blur is concerned, but stylistic preference, you can do whatever you want to. So there's the frames per second difference, and then there's that extra crop that's applied. And then also, if you are using the remote control functionality, which I do recommend because you get to see all the settings and then you can change everything like on the fly right here. You don't have to keep on reaching over and turning your camera around and putting it back. Then when you have the 4K on, you don't have all the tracking boxes like on your eye. Like I can see, maybe I'll take a picture, but basically there's like a tracking box around my eye so that you can see what it's actually tracking, but that will go away if you have it on 4K 30 frames per second, if you have the remote on. And product showcase mode also has to be turned off. So the autofocus will still work, but you just don't know if you actually go out of frame, or I should say out of focus for any part. Like if you're leaning over here and maybe it starts focusing on the box, like you're never really gonna know why or if it happened at all, because you don't have that like indicator, oh, it's tracking this, oh, it's tracking something back here. You just don't really know until you look back at the footage and then you're out of focus. And that's happened to me a few times. Now I'm assuming all of these limitations are due to the processing power of this device, but I still actually do prefer 4K because there's nothing that can really beat that sharpness. It's just really good. So let's put it back to 4K. Now this camera uses a 1.0 type sensor. It's really a 1-inch sensor, which is 13.2 by 8.8 millimeters. I have to go look at that because it's anywhere close to 1 actual inch, but that's just how camera manufacturers have been labeling things forever. So it's much larger than like a phone sensor or what you're going to see in a lot of webcams, which is generally closer to about like 6 by 4 millimeters, but it's not as big as an APS-C sensor like on the Canon M50 Mark 1 or Mark 2 or the Sony ZV-10, even my old like 2011 Canon Rebel T3 that had an APS-C sensor, which is 22.2 by 14.7, something like that. So yeah, this one will take in a decent amount of light, but not as much as APS-C, and definitely not full frame. Now the lens is non-detachable. It's built right onto the device itself. It has a focal length of, I can see it right here, 9.4 to 25.7, and the full frame equivalent of that's going to be 24 millimeters to 70 millimeters, and that's how it's displayed on screen when you're actually going through the menus. The max aperture is going to be f1.8, and then it's going to be, when it's all the way zoomed in, f2.8, and then the minimum is f11. Now photos can be taken in JPEG, RAW, or both at the same time. And if you do take it in RAW, you get a lot of different flexibility if you don't already know the benefits. If you want to change the saturation or the white balance like after the fact, or if you wanted to adjust the levels, you can do it with a lot less distortion and ruining the image compared to what you would get if you were editing like a JPEG file where a lot of the stuff is kind of set in stone because there's already been a color profile like applied to it. Now let's get into the different use cases for this camera. Standard talking head, vlogging, indoor photography, and outdoor photography. Now a talking head video is pretty much just what this is without the added B-roll, just talking straight into the camera with it mounted on something like a tripod. Now here's why the ZV-1 excels at this. First, of course, is the image quality, the optics, meaning the sensor and the lens in this case. Pretty decent. 1 inch doesn't take in a ton of light, but paired with the f1.8 aperture lens, it's more than enough for indoor use. You get a decent amount of blur in the background. Like you can see some text back there, but not a lot. Good separation for me. Even the mic's a little bit blurry. As long as you have dedicated lights, then you should be pretty good. I have an Elgato, 2 Elgato lights in front of me, a newer light to the side, then a newer that's to the side behind me that's just lighting up the background so I can get it more even. Another thing that's really good about this camera is the processing that it does. The color accuracy with the default standard creative profile is pretty close to what I see with my own eyes. I find it to be quite accurate. I like it a lot more than like Canon's colors, which I find to be a bit too red. But if you want to color grade yourself, you can just record in something like S-Log2 or S-Log3, then do all the grading on your own. And if you like HDR or high dynamic range, then it's in picture profile 10. It's kind of annoying to navigate to, but it records in HLG and then BT 2020 so that you can get HDR footage. It actually looks really nice. I can't really show an example in this video. I have to show it in a separate video because editing HDR footage is already a hassle, but editing it together with SDR footage is just an absolute nightmare. Now the sharpness is great. You can see a lot of detail without it being like artificial. Also, there's not too much grain. I believe I have the dynamic range optimizer to level 2 right now. And actually, let me demonstrate what that does. This basically will increase the brightness of like dark areas to show more detail. I have it on level 2, and this will allow you to underexpose your shot if you wanted to. So that you don't have like blown out like highlights, like if I had like a sunspot back there. So this is with it off right now, and everything is a lot darker. If you want some more of that contrast, even I've decreased the contrast by a significant amount. I've dropped it to its minimum value because I do like everything to be more lit up. This is range 1, DRO 1, 2, level 3, level 4, and level 5. Now this is pretty extreme. I'm not really sure when you would probably want to use this. I guess if you had like a massive sunspot in the back, then you could do something like this. But yeah, I keep it to level 2. I think level 2 is nice because I do like some detail in the shadows. With it off, I feel like the blacks are a little bit, like the shadows are a little bit harsh. But honestly, I think that it looks good anywhere up to like level 2 or level 3. I'm gonna just keep it at level 2 and, you know, just for my stylistic purpose. Now, this does add some grain to the image, but you can control. One of the things I like is that it doesn't add as much as if you were like to bump up the ISO. So I keep my ISO to its lowest if ever possible. So it's at the 125 right now is the base. The field of view of this device at 1080p, I believe it's 84 degrees, and it crops in right now because I'm at 4K 30 frames per second. So I don't know exactly what it is. So I did have to scoot this thing pretty far back so it wasn't like, you know, in my face. It is a little bit more than arm's length away right now. But that's one of the things that's nice with indoors. If you have it on a tripod, you can just kind of like move back or move forward. You don't have to like move like at a crazy distance or anything. It's not like this is like a 50 millimeter or something. So the sharpness, colors, dynamic range, they're all great. And the more you experiment and get used to this camera, the better you can make it. And I guess more importantly, the more you can tailor it to your own creative style. Now, some other things that are really useful when you're using this indoors for just talking head videos is the fact that it has clean HDMI. So all of these boxes and stuff that you can see like on the screen, you're not going to see that like in the actual video. A lot of cameras, like some of the older Canon ones, like even the Canon M50 Mark I, you're gonna see just all those boxes and the auto tracking and stuff like that when you use the HDMI out. This one has clean HDMI out. It's actually HDMI D that you plug into the device itself, and then A that's gonna go into like your capture card or whatever. I have it into an Elgato 4K 60 Pro. Now the battery life on this thing, it's more relevant to outdoors, but I'll just go ahead and bring it up now. It's really, really bad. It only lasts about like an hour to an hour and 20 minutes. Like on a good day, that thing burns through super fast. And if you plug it into your computer, then you can charge it while it's like in use, but it's gonna burn faster than your computer can charge this thing. So you're gonna have to plug this into like a power brick. You're gonna have to get like a long USB, micro USB cable, and then plug it into a brick so that you can keep this on. Another thing is this camera does overheat super fast at 4K, like maybe like 10-15 minutes, but don't worry, it's cool because there's a setting that you can change in there. Something about it's a temperature setting where it'll auto turn off after like standard or something, but set it to high. And I've never had this thing overheat since then. I've even been recording for like super long sessions. In fact, this session, I've had to record this twice because this microphone, this is definitely a lemon. If I use it in the US, okay, I'm not even gonna get into it. But the point is, I've had to be here for like, 8 hours. Yeah, I can keep it on. It's not gonna overheat, no problems. Now, like I said, you can plug the Sony ZV-1 right into your computer and you can use it for its live streaming mode like this. The problem is it's only gonna be at 720p, 30 frames per second. It's gonna look better than most webcams. Well, pretty much all webcams, but not gonna get 1080-60, not gonna get 4K 30. Also, the battery will die because, again, that's the USB slot that you'd be using for charging. It's gonna be plugged into your computer. It can keep it charged for a little while, but it's gonna drain faster than the wire can charge it from your computer. Personally, I use mine with a capture card. It is HDMI D. It's the micro HDMI to HDMI A, and that's how I record almost all my videos with the Elgato 4K 60 Pro. I also forgot to mention that there is a product showcase mode. So one of the interesting things, I actually have product focus turned off right now. It still does a really good job. So let me turn it on. And so yeah, if I had like a headset or something and I want to review, my face could be in the frame and would still focus on this. Usually my face would have like priority, but anything that's closest to the device, it'll have priority instead when you have the product showcase mode on. So since I review things like headsets, mics, you can see all this different stuff that I'm reviewing. It's gonna keep what's ever closest in focus. Now, the Sony ZV-1 can be used for vlogging, which is how I'm using it right now. I wouldn't really recommend it for a few reasons. The real issue that I have is just the field of view. I'm punched in so hard with this active steady shot, and it's still like really close to my face with my arm like super stretched out. So if I had it at 4K, it'd be even closer. If you're gonna be using it in 4K, not only do you get the crop, but you get an additional crop with the active steady shot. One thing that I do like is that this device is pretty light and it's gonna be outstretched, so it's really not that comfortable. If you had it at a more comfortable place, then it will be easier to hold, but also you're gonna be super close to it. So I like that it's light, but All right, so what I've done is I've put a Takstar microphone on. I'll go ahead and link which one exactly in the description, but I'm gonna have to listen to it back to hear what it sounds like with this device. This is my and I do not have the Takstar microphone plugged in right now, so we'll just hear what the built-in microphone sounds like. Here we go. Now, if you are going to be doing vlogging videos, but you're going to be sitting down and you have your device on a tripod like this, and you have an external microphone that you can plug right in, this is actually not a bad choice at all. It's really more like talking head, but it's just outdoors. The real problem I have is when you're just walking around with it. But the device itself, as far as the background separation that you can get, the quality overall in a lot of different lighting scenarios, it's like 3 p.m. right now, sun's just like beaming on me. A lot of really hot spots and stuff like that. I think this camera does a really good job. And as far as the microphone quality, well, you've heard it. So yeah, that was pretty much the long and the short when it comes to vlogging. Image stabilization off, then the optical is not enough. It's just gonna be jerking all over the place. And when the active steady shot is on, then it looks a lot nicer, but it crops in super hard, and at 4K, it's like right up in your face. It's just way, way, way too close. It's really hard to watch, honestly. Some cool things that this does though is the microphone that's inside is actually quite nice. By default, it just kind of gets bodied by wind, but the wind guard that it comes with, this dead cat, is super awesome. It blocks out wind even better than that Takstar mic that I put on it. It does an amazing job, and even though the sound doesn't have enough bass, in my opinion, you can EQ that in post. I think that it sounds really good for a built-in microphone. You could actually start without like getting a dedicated microphone and just start talking into this. I would definitely recommend getting a dedicated microphone if you're going to be using it like with a computer or something. But if you didn't want to attach something to it, then yeah, you could. So vlogging, no go for me. Now, when it comes to indoor photography, I think this thing does a great job. I'd say, let me just go ahead and start off with the weakness first. The manual zoom is really rough. Like you have to kind of like go in the menus and like dig around for it. There's a lot of stuff that you dig around in the menus for. I think overall, that's one of the biggest things about this device that really annoys me, like finding a lot of like the basic stuff, like changing like resolution or things like that. Just really tiny things like manual focus. Why is that hidden away in the menus? Yeah, it's really rough. But that's the only thing. So if it's not able to focus on something perfectly because it's like way too dark because there's like no contrast, for example, like this, it can focus on this just because like, you know, there's that little gray G, but sometimes like it will pulse like it did right there because this is all white and this is all black. So it's not really sure exactly what's going on. Now here are the rest of the attributes that I actually do like for the indoor photography. Now the shutter button, it doesn't move the camera as much as some of like the older DSLRs. Like I said, my Rebel T3, when you press that button, you kind of have to have the shutter speed at least like 1/125. Otherwise just pressing it will move it too much. This you can have it down to like 1/100, sometimes a little bit less, and it won't cause like too much jitter. You can use a remote shutter also. I really like that to change the settings and stuff like that on the fly. I've taken some pictures with that. I think you get really good separation from the background because of the combination of the sensor and the lens. Now the sensor, again, like 1 inch, not really bringing in that much light, but it does get to f1.8 as far as the lens goes. And sometimes you can even have like only part of like an object or like maybe like a headset or a mic or whatever your product is, only part of it would be in focus. And then obviously if you wanted more of it in focus, like the whole thing, you could just make the aperture a little bit narrower. If you're taking pictures with your phone, you're gonna have to use like portrait mode, which it can give you some really ugly results. I've used portrait mode a lot on this. I actually, interestingly, do prefer to take pictures with my phone for my website, even though I do have this camera, because I just don't like unplugging it and then like plugging it back to my computer to like transfer all the photos. But the quality of the pictures is just going to be better there because it doesn't have to do as much post-processing to get rid of all the grain, and then the sensor's already bigger, so it's going to do a whole lot better job in indoor lighting, and it doesn't have to fake background separation because it's just physics because of the lens and the sensor. Now another thing that's nice for outdoor performance when it comes to like vlogs is that the device is so compact. You can put it in your pocket. It also has a built-in ND filter. It's like a sunglass for your lens that you can just put it on and off, and it'll just slide on and off right there. It's extremely easy to forget that you have that on though, so do keep that in mind. So yeah, indoor photography, when you can control the light and you can control the space, I think that it really makes up for some of the limitations I'm about to mention when it comes to outdoor photography. Now, outdoor photography is pretty rough for this camera. Like it's good, but also not good. So when it comes to landscapes, yeah, no problem. But then again, you can kind of take decent landscape pictures with your phone as well, because you're going to be closing the aperture quite a bit to get like a sharper image that everything is in focus. Well, now it makes it so that the gap between like a smartphone is not as big because these actually have really, really small interest pupils anyway. The issue really comes down to when you're trying to capture like wildlife or something, anything that's moving. So I was trying to take a bunch of different pictures, take pictures of like ducks and turtles and cats and stuff like that. And a lot of the shots I just couldn't get because the camera doesn't really zoom in that far. Again, it only is 9.4 to 25.7 as far as the focal length. And then again, the full frame equivalent is 24 to 70. So 70 is really not enough to just like really punch in and get in optically on like, I don't know, any kind of animal that's walking without you getting like right up in its grill and then making it leave. So I did miss some shots because of that. And, you know, I got as many shots as I could, but, you know, there were some really cool shots of like some cats that just showed up like on the railroad tracks. I just couldn't get them because of that. Having a detachable lens, so something that I could put on like they can get more of a zoom, like how the Sony ZV-1 is, That'd be extremely helpful. And then also, again, the sensor is not that big. So if I were to have a lens that did bring in a lot of light and combine that with like APS-C sensor, like I would have with the Canon M50 or the Sony ZV-1, then in lower light performances, it could do a lot better. So it's kind of rough. This camera can't really get that wide of a shot when you're like recording yourself, but it also can't punch in that deep. It can't get that zoomed in when you're trying to like take pictures of like wildlife or something like that. Now I did get some pretty cool shots though. Like I'm not a photographer, I just make YouTube videos, but I got some interesting shots. I was messing around with like really long exposure times, like 1 second, 5 second exposure times and stuff like that. Just, you know, a bunch of different like random scenarios. I got some pretty cool shots, I think. So now for my verdict, should you get the Sony ZV-1? Well, listen to this whole thing so that you can get all the context. Talking head videos like this, yes. Indoor photography, yes. Vlogging, like holding it with your hand and then walking around outdoors, no. Outdoor photography can be used, but also wouldn't get this. And for all 4 of those use cases, I would actually recommend the Sony ZV-E10. Now, mainly it's because of the detachable lens. It's a very similar camera as far as performance goes, and the kit lens on that thing is really not that great. It's only like f3.5, but the sensor of the ZV-E10 is APS-C, which is bigger, so it can bring in more light, so it kind of counterbalances that. But you can bring in lenses that can zoom you in more, so like for outdoor photography, and then you can have wider angle lenses that can make it so that you're not super close up while you're vlogging. Maybe you can have one that has like better stabilization in it so that you don't have to punch in with the active steady shot. A ton of flexibility with the Sony ZV-E10, but do keep in mind you're gonna be spending extra money for getting different lenses. And if you're just gonna be using the device out the box how it is, you're probably better off getting the Sony ZV-1 and just saving a little bit of money because they're going to perform pretty similarly. The real benefit to the ZV-E10 is that you can switch out the lenses. I do think that both the ZV-1 and ZV-E10 are better choices than the Canon M50. The M50 can only do 4K 24 frames per second and it loses its autofocus. Like it's not nearly as good. The autofocus of this, I like it a lot. I think there are some things that I would change on it, like, you know, the little issue that I said with the 4K and the eye tracking. But overall, for this price range, I do think that this thing is quite great. It's just that the Sony ZV-E10 can solve a lot of the issues if you do replace the lens. If you want something that you can just buy, use it out the box, and then just, you know, set it, forget it, don't worry about it again, don't invest anything else in it again, Sony ZV-1, amazing choice. But if you do want to use a camera in a variety of different situations and you want a different lens for different situations, then Sony ZV-E10.